So Jessica, you're an author, a science writer, and a speaker, and The End of Bias, published in September of last year, is your first book. Bias, you write in the introduction, is woven through culture like a silver thread in cloth. In some lights, it's brightly visible. In others, it's hard to distinguish. Your position relative to that flashing thread determines whether you see it at all. My first two questions to you are, what was your first encounter with bias, do you think? And how has your, as you say, relative position to this flashing thread changed over the course of your research, writing, and publicity for the book?
Thank you. Interesting question. Great starting questions. Gosh, I would say there are probably two answers to that question about my first encounter with bias. There was my first encounter in reality and my first conscious encounter with bias. I would say the first time I really was hit over the head with bias directed at me was when I was starting out as a journalist and I was pitching national magazines and newspapers, and I had been writing for mostly regional and local publications up to that point. And I started kind of spreading my wings and sending queries to editors, at major publications. And I wasn't getting a response. And then in a moment of desperation, I had a specific query that was timed to a specific thing happening. It was a movie coming out. And I knew that if nobody picked it up, this piece of writing would just die a slow, sad death, or a fast, sad death. And so in this moment of desperation, I created a new email address and a new, just a new inbox. And I sent it out with the initials JD Nordell, as from JD Nordell instead of Jessica. And the piece was accepted right away within hours. And it started my career. And I published as JD Nordell for a while, which is a plausibly, kind of masculine, it's a masculine sounding name. And so that was sort of like, a wake-up call to me professionally, because I hadn't really been faced with a sort of A/B test like that before. But in reality, as I, talk about in the book and as I uncovered in my research, children experience and express bias. And it's something that's woven into the fabric of our lives. So in reality, I probably experienced it, decades before that, maybe even at birth. They're like, for instance, parents Google, "Is my son gifted?" at twice the rate that they Google, "Is my daughter gifted?" So, even sort of parents, as they're interacting with children, are susceptible to some of these biases.
Yeah, so already we have the stakes, which are so high, which is why interrogate one's own biases so we don't transmit them to the next generation. We'll get on to the very, very high stakes because they could not be higher based on your introduction. Before we do that, putting aside this kind of beautiful simile of this thread, because I think that what's so beautiful about this simile is that it highlights just how subtle bias is, and so fine and so difficult to, the idea of the cloth, right, would be you would need to unpick it. Thinking more kind of from the world of words, we can think about possibly how we might define bias given various definitions that you yourself present in the first chapter, which is called The Chase. I think, in other words, chasing for what we mean by bias. So we can look to Patricia Devine, who's a professor of psychology, who writes that a belief is something people actively choose, while an association, possibly we can infer bias here, is something that they absorb from their surroundings, cultural knowledge gained without their consent or even awareness. And yet, and this is why I wanted to ask you about it, Jessica, because later in the chapter, you complicate this binary of belief on the one hand and association on the other, because you say that even the idea that there are two distinct processes in the mind, the automatic one, the kind of association one, and the deliberate one, belief, is still debated, and some see the idea of the two processes as overly simplistic. So as we get started here, how should we define bias?
Yes. So it is a complicated question in terms of labeling. And by the way, I realized I don't think I answered your previous question about how my relationship to bias has changed over time. We can go back.
We can get back to that.
So traditionally in psychology, the term has been unconscious bias or implicit bias, which implies that this is something that is separate from consciously held beliefs, and that we have, in fact, these two kinds of concepts in our minds. We have associations and stereotypes and cultural knowledge that we've absorbed, but we don't necessarily believe it. And then we have beliefs and values and things that we consciously hold and express deliberately. And unconscious bias, the idea of unconscious bias, or I would say the kind of formal definition of it, is the process by which we express these concepts that have been stored in our memory as a result of encountering people and who belong to certain categories. So to kind of make this less abstract, I encounter you, Alice, and I recognize that you belong to all sorts of categories that I have learned are salient in our culture. You're a woman, you are maybe of a certain age range, I can maybe guess of a certain racial or ethnic identity, or racialized as a certain way in our culture. And these categories all have associations and stereotypes that I've absorbed as a consequence of growing up in my culture. Mm-hmm. And so when I encounter you, what unconscious bias is the process by which all of those ideas that I've absorbed over time start to influence my response to you, my feelings toward you, my judgments of you, my predictions about what you're going to say or do, my assumptions, whether I give you the benefit of the doubt or whether I insist that you prove yourself over and over. All of these kinds of things are the consequence of memories that I've stored about your social identity.
Okay, so this is great. So let's do a hypothesis here. Let's say I am a 45-year-old French Moroccan man. How would you be responding differently?
Interesting. I would have to think about those specific categories. I am, we know obviously there's a lot of anti-Arab prejudice in France. And so right. If I were someone who grew up in the French context, absorbing anti-Arab stereotypes and beliefs, I would respond to you through the lens of those stereotypes. Interestingly, I actually had an experience. I don't know if you remember this moment in the book, but I had an experience where when I was in high school, of moving to France for a short period of time and living with a host family and seeing a prejudice emerge in real time, because I had not encountered the kinds of prejudice. I'd encountered American prejudices, and I hadn't encountered the specific prejudices that exist in France. And so, it's context dependent. And
I said that specifically to kind of to point you in that direction, which is that, as you say, biases are totally learned, and we're going to get onto this, because what's so great about that, I mean, it's not great that there are biases, but what's great, and you point this out, is because they're learned, we can unlearn them. Because they're habitual, we can break out of them. And so before we get into that too, I know we're tabling many things, but we still have quite a lot of time. The question might be why, you point out over the course of the book that addressing one's biases takes great effort. It takes the will to change. It's not quick. It's not straightforward. It will likely be deeply uncomfortable and even painful for you, yourself, and others around you. So why do it? I mean, life is short, and people don't like to feel uncomfortable. Because you write, Jessica, and seriously, the stakes could not be higher here. Bias robs fields of talent, companies of ideas, and culture of progress. It robs science of breakthroughs, art and literature of wisdom, and politics of insight. By constructing the makeup of who asks questions, it shapes what questions are asked, compressing the scope of human knowledge. It is a habit that reduces the potential of individuals and undermines the gifts and resources of an entire society. So over the course of your book, you detail many scientific studies, but can you point to one or two that kind of highlight the negative effects of bias in extremis?
Yes, there are, my goodness, there are thousands of studies that document the presence of discrimination in places where people are not intending to be discriminatory, which is also kind of maybe a simplified definition of unconscious bias. Like if someone values fairness, but yet they behave in a way that is discriminatory, we might call that unconscious or unexamined bias. So to your question, what are some of the studies that stand out? There's so many, it's hard to choose. I think that some of the most disturbing and compelling research that demonstrates the presence of bias comes from the healthcare industry, or the health medicine, the healthcare field. So there are studies that show, for instance, that Black and Latino patients are less likely to be prescribed pain medication for severe pain than white patients who are expressing the same kind of distress. Very disturbingly, there is research, there are meta-analyses, studies of studies that show that a Black patient with vascular disease is more likely to undergo an amputation for a limb than a white patient who's more likely to have a limb sparing surgery or a limb sparing treatment. And this is after you control for things like the severity of the disease, the quality of the hospital, the insurance, health insurance, access to health insurance. So you control for all of these variables, and you still find that Black patients are more likely to have a limb amputated. And so, I mean, I could go on. I have a whole chapter just on health. So we could talk about many studies, but I think those findings are really stark when you consider the fact that people go into healthcare to help people and to make people's lives better. They take the Hippocratic Oath. They are they are focused on improving people's lives, and yet are still behaving in ways that are really consequential and, sometimes lethal in terms, there are studies that show that women are diagnosed later for many kinds of cancers, partially because their symptoms aren't taken as seriously. And in fact, that happened to a friend of mine whose story I tell in the book, who sadly died because her doctors did not take her symptoms seriously.
So in the case of the healthcare system, Jessica, where do we then lay the blame, right? If we can't lay the blame with the doctors who would say, I'm trying my best, I'm working long hours. If you're working for the state, let's say in France or the UK, where healthcare is free, or at least subsidized, I'm not getting paid very much by the state. Where can we put the blame here? Because as you point out, what's very hard about bias is that we can examine it on many layers. We can examine it on an individual layer, on a kind of institutional layer, or on a society-wide layer. And for you, and this is again why the thread simile is really important, it's the actual kind of slow accrual of individual biases that lead to systemic biases. But how do we unpack this, and where can we begin to break open space for change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. There are many. This is like a multi-level phenomenon. So you have individual behaviors, you have institutional policies and structures, you have larger laws and societies and larger structures that are influencing everything, downstream. And so I've come to the conclusion that we need to work on all of them at the same time. There's a debate, at least in the United States, frequently about individual solutions versus structural solutions. Where do we put our emphasis? And I had like a dark night of the soul while I was writing this book, for that reason, because I was like tearing my hair out, like where do we focus, does it make even sense to focus on individuals when we have these larger structural issues that need to be fixed? I mean, just as an aside, in the context of health, if you look at health disparities, certainly provider behavior is a contributor, but there are many other contributors too, in terms from income inequality to housing segregation. There's a whole cornucopia of contributors to health disparities. So I had this dark night of the soul, and I thought, does it even make sense to focus on individuals, doctors, for instance? But what I concluded was that no matter what we do with our structures and policies and laws and institutions, even if we burn them all down, first of all, we can't burn ourselves down, and we're the ones who are going to create the replacement. So it's essential for all of us to work on this at an individual level as well. To take the healthcare example, it's essential for doctors to learn about patterns of bias and be motivated and activated and incentivized to combat their own habits of mind in the patient interaction. Absolutely. But then it's also important to build in structures so that doctors can make better decisions. I mean, one of the stories I tell in the book is of surgeons at Johns Hopkins Hospital who instituted a computerized checklist, which allowed them to eliminate disparities in blood clot prevention treatment. And what these doctors did was, instead of just deciding who gets blood clot prevention, they had to go through a formalized list, a computerized list, check, 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 check. And then the algorithm told them whether or not this person should get blood clot prevention or not. And it eliminated the disparities between men and women. Before, there had been a large disparity between how men and women were treated, and afterwards the disparity was eliminated. So that's an example of a structural intervention that can be helpful.
Yes.
But I think they're really linked.
Yeah, and so let's talk about I suppose kind of the structural intervention that you present comes after the kind of individual interventions that are possible, which, as I was saying before the call, was one of my favorite chapters in the book, in part because it provided comic relief from, as you say, which is quite a dark and heavy topic. The reality of bias kills people and harms them physically, economically, spiritually, as you point out. So this is kind of departing on, again, this idea that because it's a habit, it can be broken, and if it's acquired, it can be cast off. So you have this chapter, Jessica, called The Mind, the Heart, and the Moment, in which you join police officers in mindfulness training. And there are some kind of funny scenes that you describe of kind of unwilling, thick-skinned lieutenants wearing t-shirts with phrases like throat punch on them, or you're sitting next to a police officer who not only says that he didn't want to be there and he'd prefer to be at home with his cats, but that his way of coping with 25 years of being in the police force was exfoliation. I mean, you can't make it up. I imagine I hope you found moments of humor in a dark kind of environment. But tell us, how can mindfulness deal with the extreme biases of the police force, helping men and women to overcome this kind of idea of the toxic buildup of ego, fear, anger, cynicism, PTSD?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a very interesting section to research and do some in-person reporting. I spent a lot of time with police officers. So there's a lieutenant out in Oregon who, long story short, realized that his colleagues were behaving really badly all the time for very, if a citizen was just kind of annoying them, they would lash out in this really disproportionate way. And so he was really looking at how to improve police performance so that they were responding appropriately and proportionately to the experiences they were having with citizens. And when he looked into the science of performance, he found mindfulness meditation. And so he wasn't really the first, but he was part of a tradition of people in public safety who were trying to introduce first responders to practices that could help them manage the complicated emotions that they had throughout their jobs. And the other thing, that he noticed, and there's a lot of research about this, is that over time, people who work in public safety become impaired by the chronic stress that they experience, and being exposed to violence, participating in violence. I mean, there's many reasons that they become kind of impaired and less able to be effective and show up as respectful, caring humans. There's the compassion kind of gets destroyed. And so the idea was that mindfulness meditation and other kinds of meditation could help kind of reshape the mind and spirit and heart of these police officers. So they've tried it. There's this chapter kind of tells the story of what happened when this was tested, and it's really complicated. I mean, there are some preliminary findings that practicing mind-body practices like meditation do have a positive effect for public safety officers. It helps them regulate their emotions. It decreases their aggression. It allows them to take in more information when they're showing up to a situation. So it has positive effects. The challenge is that officers are not very interested in this. They are very resistant. They're very defensive. They feel like, I mean, I saw this with my own eyes, at this training, there were all of these tools being offered to them, and they saw even being there as almost like a tacit admission of failure and an accusation that they were doing something wrong, which increased their defensiveness and made them less open. So, on one hand, there are interventions that are helpful, but the question is like whether people are willing and able to receive them and actually use them for their own benefit and for the benefit of the community that desperately needs officers to behave with respect and care.
This is such a great point, Jessica, because it gets to a question, what I hope that people can leave this conversation with practical tools about how to address their own biases and the biases of those around them. And would you say that it's simply not worth the effort of calling other people out on their biases if you don't feel that they're open to change? So, that's something that I think you said you can guess kind of my generation. I'm 25. I think my generation, certainly, people in their 20s and younger, come across older people, and I imagine you do too, like older people who grew up in a different context, who grew up in a different time, who hold deep biases that come out in every shape and size and every color. And is it worth having these uncomfortable conversations with them, or should we be putting our effort towards more kind of productive and ripe areas of change and growth?
Yes. I don't think it's misplaced effort to talk to people who disagree or who are resistant for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that humans are by nature very susceptible to social norms. And so even if someone doesn't agree with a particular perspective or value some of the things we're talking about, they may still be influenced by the presence of other people who care about those things, who they're close to, or who they have some kind of relationship with, or who they're influenced by. And so I think it's always important to speak up. Like if you see an injustice, even if you think the person is not going to be responsive, it's always important to speak up, not only because your own response could potentially influence that person, but more importantly, it can influence all the people who are observing that interaction. And it starts to create more of a social norm around fighting against bias and injustice. I also think, though, that there are productive ways that we can talk across differences that don't have to necessarily result in, divisiveness and disrespect and kind of like retreating into our separate bunkers, which call out culture seems to really do.
But this is curious, and I think it's almost you describe how you yourself were the recipient of this kind of call out culture. You wrote several articles that were criticized online. Can you talk about the response to the articles, how emotionally and kind of intellectually you received it, and what you learned from that experience that you can tell us about how to move forward? Because as you point out, this is an ongoing recursive process. One will make mistakes, of course, because we live in a biased society. So how do we bounce back from essentially ongoing and inevitable failure?
Yes, I'm really, really glad you asked that, because, just recently I've started to think about this work with the metaphor of learning a language. I think tackling our own biases is less like checking off a list and more like learning a language. And if you think about learning a language, like, what do you need to do to learn a language? You need to practice it a lot. You need to have a certain kind of work ethic and commitment to a goal to become more fluent. You have to make mistakes. You're not going to be perfect when you first start learning a new language. And you have to practice it in the world. Like you can't just be sitting in a room alone working on your bias, or trying to overcome your own bias, like quietly with no risk, just as an internal process. In the same way that you can't probably become fluent in a language just by yourself. You have to practice it with other people. And so I think, if we think about it more like that, then maybe that can open us up to understanding that mistakes are inevitable and they're just part of the learning process. But I think your question was like, how do you deal with kind of the emotional consequence of making mistakes and feeling the feelings that go along with that, like shame, sometimes embarrassment, guilt, feeling very threatened even by others, others looking down or disagreeing or being offended by something that one has said. And this is, I don't think it can be overstated how challenging it really is. I mean, I certainly experienced this myself, as you were alluding to. I wrote one article that was criticized by some for certain blind spots that I had. And, my first reaction was to get kind of defensive a little bit. Sort of a natural, almost threat response. And then what I had to do was take a step, take a moment, remind myself of my goal, which is to become more fluent, in this practice, to get better, and to realize that we're all somewhere on a journey toward better behavior, unlearning biases, unlearning toxic ideas that we've inherited. And it takes time, it requires mistakes, and that kind of emotional experience is also just part of the journey. So developing a lot of emotional skill and resilience and not wanting to retreat and disengage is really, really an important part. So I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, and I think, what's so wonderful about your book, Jessica, is you have at once all of the scientific rigor, which supports the argument, but then you also have just such a fantastic ability to capture the scientific rigor in powerful metaphors. And so here's a great example, and certainly one that would resonate with our audience, which is that, as you say, it's a deeply uncomfortable experience learning a language, and you constantly make mistakes and humiliate yourself and feel foolish, and you have to just keep kind of showing up. I wanted to read also this beautiful description that you write about your own kind of experience with bias, describing it as a flicker, unseen, unchecked, that taps at behaviors, reactions, and thoughts. You write, I kept watching for that flutter. Oh, flicker, flutter. I kept watching for that flutter, like a person with a net in hand waiting for a dragonfly. And I caught it many times. This was one step among many as I worked to end my own prejudice, watching for it, catching it and holding it up to the light, releasing it, watching for it again. You've been writing about this topic, as you say, for a while. You published The End of Bias, beginning. There we can see, just even in the title, right, that tension of like the end and then the beginning, in September of last year. How do you feel about your biases today? Are you at the end or are you at the beginning?
Oh gosh. Oh, every end is a new beginning, I think. How do I feel about my biases today? I think I feel both more urgency and more compassion about my own biases and others' biases directed at me. I think earlier in this process, I would get pretty angry when I detected, condescension or other kinds of gender bias that are part of the common patterns that women experience. And I wouldn't say I completely, never have an emotional reaction anymore, but I see so much of the larger context now that I don't take things as personally when someone directs bias at me. I see that behavior as almost an inevitable consequence of living in a culture that has perpetuated these ideas for thousands of years. It's an exciting surprise when someone doesn't, act in a condescending way toward me as a woman, or carry out other kinds of common patterns of gender bias.
Yeah, can you talk about this point? Because this is my bias as a former history major, but you said to know the context, right? And you spend actually quite a lot of time in your book talking about this, which is it's easier for us to begin to unpack our biases if we've studied the history. And as history majors are in steep decline in the US, as people move towards kind of more STEM subjects, can you at once please defend the tradition of studying history and tell us why it's really important to study history as a way to also begin to think about our biases?
History is essential. I am the biggest cheerleader for history departments, the study of history majors. And there is good data that supports the importance of history and the study of history as actually a bias intervention, as a prejudice intervention. So there are two kind of ways of thinking about it. One is that there is research that shows that the more we understand the history of discrimination and the more we understand past prejudice, the better we're able to identify prejudice in the present and discrimination in the present. And I personally experienced that over the course of working on this project. I particularly remember reading about 19th century medical racism, scientific racism. So the infusion of explicitly racist ideas into medicine and into the way doctors thought about Black patients and white patients. And really reading that history, reading the medical studies and the medical papers that were written and published in the 19th century that espoused so much deep racism, allowed me to really see its presence in healthcare, for example, today. not to mention the wider society. And so that idea that understanding the past prejudice allows us to see the present is called the Marley Hypothesis. And there've been a number of interesting papers that support this idea. But the other idea, if I can I tell you why else I think history is important? So the other reason I think history is so important is that, as you alluded to earlier, Alice, ideas of racial hierarchy, gender hierarchy, other kinds of prejudice and bias and discrimination are not natural. They were human inventions that emerged at specific places and times, and often for specific purposes, whether they're economic purposes or political purposes or social purposes. When I went back into the history and I found places and times that predated these patterns, like ancient Egypt, where we see no evidence of skin color prejudice, or Mesopotamia, where we see female deities being revered as authority figures. Inanna, a goddess of sexuality and war, being the patron goddess of the city of Uruk. When we see places and times before our current patterns were really entrenched, I find that incredibly powerful because it shows that it's an invention. It shows that this was something that humans created. And it gives us, I think, the courage to create the next thing, to create a time after these patterns.
It's such a great point because your quote about fluttering and flickering brought me back to, I was also an English major, Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. And one of the most famous lines in that, right, is we live in the flicker. And as a student of history, that's what you realize, which is that our current slice of reality, our current slice of time is so short. It's like a flicker compared to the long history of humankind. So I would agree wholeheartedly with you. And this gets to another question I had. We have questions in the chat. I would urge people to post more, please. Please. But you mentioned just now, Jessica, that you happened upon these 19th century studies that helped you understand contemporary racism in medicine. But in one moment in the book, kind of feeling that there weren't enough studies, particularly about the longitudinal effects of bias, you actually had to create your own study. Mm-hmm. And you talk about this throughout, right, that there is a kind of absence of statistics all across the board. And so kind of in the interest of it's a kind of fun question, I guess, where or what studies would you have liked to have existed that would have made your life a lot easier?
That is a good question. Yes. So one study, one of the big questions I had going into this project was, well, how big of an impact do these everyday kinds of biases have if you look at them over a person's life or over a population or over a career? And that there were no answers to that question. And so, right. So I ended up conducting my own research with some computer scientists to create a computer simulation to look at a simulation of a workplace to try to understand how bias adds up and what its cumulative impact is. So what I would love to see, if I could wave a magic wand, is a longitudinal study that tracks, 1,000 people and actually looks at the kind of everyday experiences they have of unexamined bias, and then charts, its accumulation and its impact over time. That would be something I'd be really interested in, but the resources would be vast to undertake that research. It would be hard. We really desperately need more research about Indigenous communities. There's very little research about bias faced by Native Americans, for instance, First Nations folks in Canada. Most of the prejudice research about Indigenous people in the US is about college mascots. That's like, it seems like 90% of the research about prejudice and Native Americans. So we need a lot more research about what kinds of patterns they face and what could be useful interventions for those patterns. We need more research about interventions into age bias. We need more, I mean, in general, we need more, this is like my wish list. We need more randomized controlled field experiments in the real world that look at prejudice interventions and what works. Because a lot of interventions that are out there have never been tested, or they've never been tested in the real world. They've only been tested in a lab. So yes, I could give you, we could talk for a very long time about like my checklist of research gaps that I would love to see filled.
Maybe that's your second book, just a long series, just a long list of all of the ways in which the research should be updated. And actually, I did just want to put a pin in this, which is that I found your very brief discussion of age bias really moving, because you're basically saying you may not experience bias now, but you'll experience bias when you get older. Because
yeah.
Society is biased towards youth and novelty and the young.
Yeah, and interestingly, you know, I think age bias is so powerful because for people in really privileged positions in society, like, you know, wealthy white men, age bias is sometimes their first actually experience of real social bias and these kinds of biases we're talking about. So I think actually age bias could be potentially like a very helpful, you know, lever in bringing in even more people to the community who are concerned about this issue.
It's great. I think I agree. Okay, let's move on to the audience, the chat. So hello, we have as ever a vastly international audience. Hello to Claudette in Switzerland, Sophie in Normandy, Lola in New York, Michael in Paris, Bill from Dallas. David wrote, I'm a physician and have some ideas about healthcare bias. Please tell us what they are. We'd love a follow-up. We have a question from somebody called, I don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm very sorry. I have no, my language is limited to English and French. They write, I understand the importance of bias, but isn't it somewhat a kind of an excuse? So one might say, I'm sorry, I did my very best, but I haven't realized I had a bias. To what extent do people blame kind of mistakes on bias, I guess to what extent does bias become a kind of catch-all for all badness?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's Agnieszka I hope
Agnieszka, yes.
Thank you for the question. Yes, that is it's a really important point, and I think there's a very fine line that has to be walked in talking about bias. I mean, one of the researchers who I follow really talks about this kind of balance between telling people that they are responsible for changing their own behavior without heaping blame and shame on them for not knowing or for, you know, not being as skilled. So I don't think we certainly don't want to say, oh, it's not your fault and therefore you don't have to do anything about it, or it's not your fault and it's normal and so there's nothing to be done. And that is a risk in talking about how this is unintentional. So I think, you know, when we talk about it, we really have to emphasize that these are inherited ideas that you didn't necessarily go out and choose on your own, but that we all have a responsibility to show up in a humane, ethical way in our lives, in our communities, in our relationships. And so it's our responsibility to combat these tendencies that we have.
Great. And let's go to the second question relatedly, or I mean, this goes to kind of a personal question here. Have you identified a bias in yourself that you'd be willing to share?
I would say every bias that I talk about in the book,
you have, yeah,
something that I identified in myself. I don't think there's a bias, whether it's gender bias or racial bias or age or religion or disability, that I have not seen in my own heart and mind, at least to some extent. And I mean, one of the stories that I will share is that during the writing of this book, I mean, this is very like meta. During the writing of this book, I went to the library one day. This was like very early in the process. And it was very quiet. I was working, and these two men walked past me, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see that they were unrolling prayer rugs, and they were getting ready to pray during, one of 5 times a day. And I saw that my hands were starting to get sweaty. Like I had this fear response connected to identifying Muslim people. And I had no idea that I had that response. I mean, I didn't even know it existed in my mind until I saw the physical evidence of my, having this stress response, fear response. And I mean, I was writing about cognitive bias while experiencing this, in real time. And so I think I started the project thinking I'm probably a little less biased than everybody else. And I ended the project with a very humbled sense of my own susceptibility to these patterns that are pervasive.
It's a great point, and thank you, Agnieszka, whose name is Polish, for the wonderful questions. And it highlights what you said earlier, Jessica, which is that bias cannot be dealt with in it has to be enacted in the world, not only to have the uncomfortable conversations, but to actually figure out what our biases are, because unless we come up against the world, we won't actually know what our biases are. Right. Okay, Michael has a long, wonderful question, and he asks, is implicit bias exclusively generated by culture? Haven't there been social science studies that suggest that newborns show preferences for symmetrical facial features, which is perhaps a proxy for attractiveness, that many infants at even 6 years old begin to favor their own ethnicity? Not, he points out in capital letters, that this justifies our biases, but that these studies, if consistently confirmed, suggest that reducing bias, much less eliminating them, will be a much bigger challenge than we think.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I don't know about the infants 6 months beginning to favor their own ethnicity. I'm just not familiar with that research, or the newborn research about symmetry, but certainly that kind of category of research, exists. We certainly developed for evolutionary reasons the tendency to categorize and to use heuristics, to use mental shortcuts, because we simply don't have the cognitive reserves to constantly make decisions based on new information. So we use information that's stored in order to make predictions, in order to just function in the world. Like, I need to be able to quickly recognize that something is a threat or not, for instance. So I think the question when it comes to bias is, are we behaving in the world in ways that are consistent with our values? I think that's the question. And there might be many situations where we react spontaneously because of all sorts of reasons, whether it's, cultural indoctrination, or because of a past experience we had, or, maybe because of evolutionary reasons. In some cases, there might be ways that we react that are spontaneous and automatic. But I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, like, are we showing up? Are we behaving in a way that's consistent with our values? And if not, what can we do to change course and behave in a way that's more consistent with our values? And I'm not suggesting it's easy. I mean, these are deeply embedded ideas and concepts and patterns. But to me, that's the question. Sometimes people do ask, well, isn't this just kind of how we've always existed? Aren't we sort of inherently tribal? Doesn't it make sense for us to favor our own kind over another group? And so I think it's a matter of like, do we want to use our prefrontal cortex and respond in a way that makes sense for living in a pluralistic society that is democratic and civil and inclusive?
Right, and you point out, Jessica, in your book that our impulse to categorize has always been there, but the categories themselves are constructed. And actually, let's just add in this piece, because it is so insidious and so shocking. I didn't know it until I read the book, which is, now we're going to turn to the part of the event where we say, please buy the book. I'll put all the links in the chat, but just I'm priming your brain now for when I do post the links that you go and get it and give it to all of your friends. It's a really nice way, if you feel that someone in your life is very biased, it's maybe a nice way to start the conversation. You can say, you don't have to say anything, just say, I saw this book and I thought of you.
Or just I thought of, especially what I've heard from people is that the book it's being received by folks who have not necessarily been receptive to these ideas before, because it's very grounded in science and data. And so if someone has kind of a skeptical mindset and they're, looking for evidence and science and research and data, it's a helpful way to have that conversation.
Let's just talk, because we're saying kind of generally that culture and society wants us to kind of have biases, and that we grow up in a kind of biased ecosystem, and the waters in which we're swimming are biased. But it's even more horrible and insidious than that, which is that bias has become monetized. And you talk about how, for example, the film Straight Outta Compton, actually, the kind of like media person behind this, the vice president of the company of Universal, created race-specific trailers to target Facebook users based on their race. In other words, reinforcing biases for financial outcomes. I mean, that is truly sick, no?
Yes, and it worked.
And it was a high-grossing film, exactly. So I guess there's not much more to say. We had a question. We had a comment from Jacqueline, who talks about their practice of applied Buddhism and training to develop compassion is to notice qualities and concerns of other people and to notice similarities, other people who are not just like me. They write there is a prayer called just like me. This person wants to be happy, healthy. Can you talk about this kind of this meditation?
I'm so glad that Jacqueline is pointing out compassion meditation, because this is an incredibly powerful tool. I was really excited about the research about compassion meditation. I spent some time talking about it. So one of the really interesting things about compassion meditation, which as this participant points out, in compassion meditation, you repeat to yourself for sort of ever increasingly large groups of people, may this person be well, may this person be happy. You apply it to someone you like, someone you don't like, the whole world, a community, sort of different, may this person be well, may this group be well, may they be happy, may they be free from harm. And what the research shows, this is preliminary, it's early research, so I should say suggests that people who engage in this kind of meditation over a period of time actually show differences in their brains. And the kind of difference that we see is over certain areas of the brain, there's more similarity in the activation of self and other, the parts of the brain that are activated in response to self and other, than in people who don't do this meditation. So this is like fascinating, because what it suggests is that through the practice of loving kindness meditation, we can actually start to perhaps dissolve a little bit of the boundary between self and other. And I mean, that's interesting for so many reasons. But another outcome that we see is that when people engage in this kind of meditation, they behave in more altruistic ways toward others as well. So yes, it's incredibly powerful. And if we all practiced loving kindness meditation for even 5 minutes a day, I think the world would be a very different place.
Because I've just posted a link to love and kindness meditation. And it's worth pointing out too that, and I said this to Jessica before we started, but I met Jessica's book through Jenny Odell, who also herself has a really fantastic book that's, it's similar in the sense of we're thinking, as we were saying before the call, it's thinking about attention, and biases are a form of attention. And Jenny in her book points out the really, how to kind of dissolve the I thou difference in the book. And so you can apply it, of course, to other people, but also Jenny is, I think, pointing us to apply it to nature and the environment, which of course is very urgent cause to think about today. That is a whole other can of worms. But as we've had our conversation, Jessica, there are so many other kind of can of worms that one might open, which is again yet another reason to go just buy the book, because we only broached really the surface of just some small parts of the book, because it is so rich and rigorous in its research, but again, such a pleasure to read. I'm posting the link in the chat, and I will send you the link tomorrow in an email when I've slept and go into the office. And in the meantime, thank you all so much for being here. Jessica, thank you so much for tuning in from the States.
Yeah, great questions. And I just wanted to say, I'm really eager to hear what people think. If you have a chance to take a look at the book, and feel free to reach out. My website is jessicanordell.com. There's a contact button there. So I really always love to hear from readers. If you have responses or follow-ups, feel free to reach out. And I am, really grateful for the engagement.